Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. So just to kick us off, could you introduce yourself and your role at the Future Forest Company?
Well, my name is Jim Reilly. I am the forestry manager for the Future Forest Company. And my role basically is providing professional and technical advice to the Future Forest Company's forest operations. Those operations can be quite extensive and involve things like land purchase and economics, carbon sequestration, ecology, land use, even purchase of machinery, plants and materials.
Okay, thank you. So what do you find most rewarding about your job?
Forestry as a job is exceedingly rewarding, and one of the reasons it's rewarding is because it covers such a wide spectrum. First of all, it's a biological and social science, and it's also an art. It's a social science because forests don't actually need people. So a farm needs a farmer. Natural forests can exist in their own right and have done for 80 million years, or longer than that, in fact, much longer than people have been about. But a forester is basically somebody who goes in to manage a forest for the benefits of society. And those benefits can be a great range of things from ecology, soil, hydrology, site protection, grazing, timber. The list is pretty endless. And therefore, the job is very exciting, and I'm always doing something new every single day. And I've done it for nearly 35 years, and it's never bored me.
It sounds fantastic, like a really, really lovely job. So in terms of conservation and restoration, what sort of trees should be planted on degraded land?
It depends what you mean by degraded land. Usually, degradation occurs because of a human use. So it may have been sort of inappropriate agricultural use, or it might be some industrial use. As always with trees, the first thing that dictates what you can do with the site is the soil condition. So if it's a degraded industrial site, that throws some quite challenging conditions which you need to resolve either by some methods of preparation, but also careful tree selection. And then the next thing, of course, is the climate in which it exists. And then you need to match both soils and climate to the individual silvicultural characteristics of the trees. So whether they like to grow in exposed areas or whether they like to grow in the shade of other trees, etc. So that is the way you select trees, if you like, for replanting degraded land. I hope that answers the question anyway.
Yeah, it really does. Thank you. So could you explain a little bit more about the importance of planting the right tree in the right place, particularly in the context of the estates in Scotland that the Future Forest Company is replanting? So what sort of trees are we looking at in these areas?
Right. Okay. Yes, certainly. So, right tree, right place. It means different things to different people depending on their objectives. What I will say is that it is climate and soil and tree specific. I suppose the best way to explain right tree, right place is to explain what happens if you don't get it right. The first of all is your trees probably won't establish; they'll die. The second is they do establish; they may be much more vulnerable to changes in weather conditions and to diseases. We've obviously got an issue with climate change. So sometimes we might be in a difficult position whereby the trees we'd like to plant and actually belong there in the past might not suit the site in the future. And so we have to make changes to the way we do stuff. With the best will in the world, you might want to re-establish what was originally there. But if the climate is going to change in a particular way, you need to have some additional species of trees that can go either way. So if it gets colder, which it might do, then you can get one group of trees that will succeed. And if it gets warmer, then you might have another group of trees that succeed, which comes back to another major point. Nature likes diversity, so mixed species of trees are most resistant. So what we try and do is, wherever possible, to plant only native mixed tree species. And that's the right tree in the right place as far as I can see. So there you go.
Amazing. It's definitely more complex than I've assumed. Yeah, because I don't know, I just assumed that maybe once you know the sort of tree that was there in the past, you just replant the same sort. But like what you're saying about fitting it for the future as we expect it is really interesting. Something I've never really considered.
It gets more complex actually as well. So, for example, the different tree species occur in a process of succession, if you like. You can have several trees that will meet the right climate and site criteria, but in the life of a forest, those trees may suit certain sort of time regions, if you like. So some of them are very light demanding and like open space and like to move into open space. And a forest that's progressing naturally forward on a front would maybe contain light demanding species like birches. As that forest progresses further and further, the canopy gets darker and other species then take over. What we plant originally in a site may not be what you end up with 300 years later, simply because the trees that are most adaptable to establishing on a new site are not necessarily the trees that will then suit the conditions that occur later. Yeah, it's exceedingly complex, yes.
Yeah, I find it's absolutely fascinating. I feel like I could ask lots more questions.
You can do if you wish.
If we had time, we
Yeah.
could keep talking about it for ages. A really quick one again, just
Far away.
so if you're planting trees now, through these early succession trees, will you be leaving them for the next few decades, or at some point will you start planting these later succession trees?
Well, again, it's site specific. I would be inclined to put trees that are later succession, if you like, in with that mix to start off with, to give it sort of a boost. What we're doing by planting is accelerating what nature would do naturally. So we make compromises when we do that. In some cases, nature could forest an area in several years. In other places, it could take hundreds of years to do it. We want to do it now for a whole raft of reasons. So we do it by a thing called silviculture. And silviculture is basically like, in engineering, you can't ignore the laws of mechanics. In forestry, you can't ignore the laws of silviculture. There are various methods you can do to establish trees. I mean, common practices are, for example, things like nurse species, where you plant one type of tree that grows quite quickly and is quite light demanding. And maybe a tree that likes shade, you might plant that within that mix so that one provides shade for the other. And that's one method of doing it.
In terms of planting trees, how can a tree affect the space around it?
Firstly, a forest is a system. I mean, that's the first thing we must be clear about. A forest is a system, a biological entity, like a human body is. It's full of all sorts of different animals and things that do all sorts of different things, and they work together in a complex way. When you plant a single tree, the benefits are much less than when you plant a whole load of trees in a forest. That said, it's easy to understand a single tree. So the benefits you'll get are, well, first of all, there's like a cultural and aesthetic benefits, so it's a tree you've planted, it'll be around probably a lot longer than most humans will be. In some cases, trees can live for many thousands of years. But ordinarily, trees live, say, maybe 80 to 300 to 500 years. So there's an entire community will evolve around the tree of insects, animals, and plants, which is why older forests and older trees are very, very important. And you'll probably notice that in woodlands, the soil is slightly drier than it is outside. So there's a regulation effect that trees have with their interaction with the roots in the ground that regulates the way water flows through. So trees have an interaction with fungi in the ground where the tree provides complex carbohydrates and the fungi provides nutrients, and they actually grow into each other. And some of those fungi and toadstools you identify in woodlands are actually living with the trees. They go together.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. There's just so much to learn from it. But how long will it take for planted trees, especially the ones being planted by the Future Forest Company, to reach that peak state of forest?
Ordinarily, it takes about 5 years from planting for trees to be considered established. But at that point, I wouldn't consider a large expanse of trees as a forest. I think between 10, depending on the species in the area, between 10 and 20 years to really feel like it's a wooded forest area. And then to be actually a forest itself, well, you're looking possibly 50, 100, 200 years. Because what happens then is actually it's more complex, because not only are the trees there, but there are other animal and plant assemblages that need to move in to make that system, that ecosystem work well. I would say anything over sort of 20 years that's extensive trees is a forest, but a forest in the sense that it's an entity in its own right, a self-perpetuating system. I would probably say you're looking hundreds of years to achieve that. There is a caveat with this as well. Around the world, predominantly forests are lost not to logging operations, but predominantly to farming. That's where they go. Foresters have no interest in cutting all their trees down because they would be out of a job. It's just a point I'd like to make. It often gets confused. In the UK, we plant trees, and we plant trees because we're re-establishing forests on agricultural land, and land that was trees that became agriculture, and then we're now putting trees back. And the reason we plant is because we don't really have regenerative stock around. The UK has one of the lowest forest covers in the world. In places like Europe, where they have a much higher tree cover, they rely much more on natural regeneration. So they'll manage their forests so that they can regenerate trees under the canopy of other trees. It's very difficult and very time consuming to get trees to expand outwards any distance. So we end up planting. The best method of regenerating forests is actually through regeneration within the canopy. And a lot of silvicultural systems, in fact, almost all of them, bar things like clear fell, use that system to regenerate woodland. And therefore you keep the same provenance and origin of trees on the same site, and you get this good mixed assemblage of trees as well.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what to look out for in these later succession, more established woodlands. So are there certain indicator species that we should be looking out for?
In the UK, we have very little ancient forest. There's hardly any left at all, and pretty much all our forests have been affected by man and agriculture. In the Highlands of Scotland, you can go maybe to see what forests would look like hundreds of years ago. But these forests that contain ancient Caledonian pines, they are very much artificial in the sense that they're native trees, but they're been subject to grazing pressures from sheep and deer. And therefore, that woodland is not quite as it may have been many thousands of years ago. In places like England and Wales, if you go out into the countryside and you see woodlands with not quite straight edges, they tend to be very much older woodlands. They contain predominantly broadleaf trees, though not always. And my favourite places to visit for really ancient old trees are the oak trees in Sherwood Forest. And these are some of the oldest oak trees in Europe. They're very big, wide, stag-headed trees. They are conservation trees of great status and well worth a visit if anybody wants to go and have a look at them. Probably rambled, but I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, it absolutely answers my question. At this stage, is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything that I haven't asked that you think would be important for people to know?
The only thing I'd add is that I think when people look at forestry now, typically forestry in the UK is poorly categorised, I think. And the vast majority of the industrial forestry people see is based on plantations and clear fell systems. And that system is improving, and the structure of modern UK productive forest is improving, and wildlife and conservation is getting better. However, I don't think that is the end of the story. And I think personally, from my point of view, I would like to see a lot more British forestry move towards European systems of silvicultural practice. And I would like to see a lot more what we call close to nature forestry, where we can have a sort of no intervention native woodland. It only serves a few ecosystem services, so there's not so many rural jobs come out of that as you would out of the other thing. And they're people we must consider. I plead for the rural population who often suffer the same deprivations of people in the inner cities, but have less of the opportunities. And therefore, that we must consider when we do forestry, they are also an objective to support them and their families with jobs and incomes, but in a way that is progressive and supports nature and is sustainable. That's why I'm very keen on more close to nature forestry that maintains all of the quality ecosystem services and the use of native trees and habitats and everything, but also has a slightly productive element that focuses on quality of product. But that's what I would like to see British forestry move. I think a more close to nature system would be beneficial. Whether we'll get that, I don't know. I think the point is I would like to see more British forestry move to continuous cover systems and close to nature practices.